समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Did the Tatas make a mistake by buying Air India? Well, there are times when I feel they probably think they made a huge mistake. If you look at social media, why just social media? If you look at mainstream media, you'll find that there's a new crisis reported every second day. Passengers complain about Air India. There is general hostility to the way Air India treats its passengers. I don't think the Tatas ever recognized it was going to be like this. Buying Air India for them was an emotional rather than a financial decision. J.R.D. Tata was chairman of Air India for many, many years. He founded the company that was merged into Air India. Even Ratan Tata was chairman at one stage in his life. And he once told me that he always wanted to get Air India back in the fold because there was an emotional attachment to Air India and a belief that they could turn it around. Well, it hasn't quite worked out that way. But to be fair to the Tatas, I think they realized from the beginning it was never going to be an instantaneous thing. It was going to take a while. But did they realize that the journey would be so difficult that during the time they were waiting for it to be turned around, there would be so much badnami that the Tata name would be dragged into the mud? I don't think so. I think they thought that things were going to be very different. Now, I am not exactly objective about Air India. The first flight I ever took as a child was in Air India. And through the years, I've been flying Air India. I used to do it initially on the grounds that if I was an Indian, and I used to remember come back from London every 3 months or so, and I always took Air India in preference to British Airways and other operators on that route because I believed as an Indian it was incumbent on us to fly Indian Airlines. I know it's not a logical view, it's not a view that you can defend in today's international environment, but that's always been my view. Through thick and thin, through good and bad, I've always been an Air India loyalist. There have been good periods, there have been like now, not so good periods, but it hasn't affected my loyalty to Air India. Now, I mention all this because there's now a lot of myth-making and straightforward lying going on. If you listen to the stuff Air India's PR people or people speaking on behalf of Air India or apologists for Air India are saying, basically they're saying two things. One of them is that, it's a mess. We've inherited this old public sector staff. It's so difficult to get them to change. What can we do? The other is that, the planes are terrible. It'll take a long time to buy new planes. And until we buy new planes, nothing will change. Now, there's something to both of those criticisms. It's always easier to start a new organization than it is to turn one around. And yes, Air India planes are a problem. If you've traveled Air India to North America recently, you'll know the bad condition of the aircraft. And many of the engineering problems they have come down to old aircraft or not so old aircraft, which were not properly maintained. So to that extent, what they're saying is accurate. But let's remember they knew what they were buying. So none of this can be a surprise. And what I also resent is the sort of reluctance on Air India's management to admit how badly they're screwing up. The longest and most recent interview I've read with Campbell Wilson, who is the CEO of Air India, appointed by Singapore Airlines, where he's, I think, worked most of his life, including a stint running a low-cost airline called Scoot, I think. He said, I think with massive understatement, that yes, things were not perfect, but this is a mass transportation business. Now, Wilson spent much of that interview, as have Air India's people generally, when they talk to the media, saying things like, don't worry, We're going to get lots of new planes. And when we get lots of new planes, things will be fine. And they've ordered, if you believe the press, between $6 to $7 million worth of new planes. There will be, over the next several years, 400 and something planes arriving for Air India. So we're told, wait till these planes arrive, and those dates keep being pushed back. But they keep saying that when those planes arrive, things will be fine. Well, by the time the planes arrive, Wilson and everybody else involved probably have gone back to Singapore. So it's an easy thing to say. It's people like us who fly Air India who are stuck with the present situation. But there are things that I resent about the kind of attitude they're taking. I resent the lack of respect of passengers, and I resent also the way in which they do myth-making about Air India, public sector, white elephant, etc., etc. Now, the version we are given is that J.R.D. Tata ran Air India. One fine day, the government nationalized it, and it was downhill ever since then. Well, that's not exactly true. Yes, Air India did grow out of the old Tata Airlines, but it was not unusual in those days for airlines to be run by governments. They required a lot of money to buy aeroplanes and stuff like that. And the Tatas wouldn't necessarily have had the money to do that in those days. And most international airlines, why just Air India? Air France, Lufthansa, British Airways, or BOAC as it used to be, all of them were owned by the governments. And even today, the best airlines in the world, Emirates, Singapore Airlines, their ultimate owners through sometimes investment companies or whatever are governments. So being owned by governments was not a terrible thing or something that they sprung on J.R.D. Tata. In fact, J.R.D. Tata continued as chairman of Air India, accepting a salary of just 1 rupee because he was that kind of man. And he led it from success to success. When we talk about the glory days of Air India, and we talk about the 50s and the 60s, it was already a nationalized company. J.R.D. Tata did run it, but no, the Tatas did not own it. Now, things changed. Things changed around 1977 when Morarji Desai summarily got rid of J.R.D. Tata, and after that, government influence increased. But to say that after that it was downhill is also wrong, because Air India was not a bad airline even after they got rid of J.R.D. Tata. Many, many managing directors with talent had a shot at running it. Rajan Jaitley turned it around in the 1980s. It was a very good airline then. Yogi Deveshwar, appointed in 1991, ran it so well that it bragged in those days that it made 1 crore a day in profits. It's been a long time since this crowd has talked about making 1 crore a day in profits, right? So the view that Air India was always useless and that they had to privatize it is not necessarily correct. There were very, very good phases in Air India. To say, as they say now, that it's a public sector mentality, and I think it's always a mark of weakness when a management abuses its own employees or casts slurs on them and says, because these chaps are no good, that we're in this mess. Well, no. These were the same chaps who were there when they had good management, when Yogi ran it. There are very many good people at Air India. I know a lot of them personally. Many have given their lives to Air India. They've never actually had the leadership they deserve. And the reason they haven't had the leadership they deserve is because of the government. But we'll come to that. Now, in that interview where Campbell Wilson talked about it's a mass transportation business, he also said, and I thought that was interesting, that they'd reduced the average age of Air India's employees from 54 to, I think, 36. He talked about the thousands of people they had hired to work for Air India. I forget the figure. It was like 7,000 new people, or maybe it was 9, had been hired. I don't think he disputed, nobody at Air India disputes, that most department heads at Air India now have been newly appointed. They've been appointed by the Tatas or possibly by Singapore, which is sort of the godfather of the airline at the moment. So to keep blaming the poor staff, when you've actually changed so many staff people and you brought in so many new people, is unfair. It doesn't tell the full story. All the same, and when I mentioned that conversation with Ratan Tata, all of us longed for Air India to be privatized. Why was that? I'll explain. Any managing director, no matter how competent, whether it was Rajan Jaitley, Yogi Deveshwar, any of these people, even Sunil Arora, all of them had to negotiate with the government. They had to find a way of putting off joint secretaries and ministers who would want to interfere. Michael Mascarenhas, one of their best MDs, was victimized by the aviation minister and ultimately exonerated. But always there was the problem of dealing with the government. Now, it didn't necessarily stop people from being good or Air India from doing well, but it was always a tightrope walk. It was always a negotiation. So the argument that people like me had, because we argued quite strongly for privatization, was that once you privatized, the MD of Air India wouldn't have to go to joint secretaries, he wouldn't have to suck up to the minister, he wouldn't have to work out how to handle the government, he would be free to run it. And Campbell Wilson is the first CEO in a long time who's not had to worry about the government, not had to worry about bureaucrats. So with a liberated management and with good managers, the airline should be doing much better than it is now. The problem is, it isn't. Let's go to this business about planes, which they're going on about, these billions of dollars of planes. Look, of course Air India needs new planes. Of course they should buy new planes. Of course things will get better as far as the fleet is concerned. But let's not forget, we've been here before. I remember in 2006 when Praful Patel was aviation minister, and in those days aviation ministers were more important to Air India than they are now. Air India bought 60-something aircraft from Boeing. As far as I remember, 40% were Boeing 777s, 40% were Dreamliners, the others were 737s. Lots of new aircraft came, and it was actually, I'll be honest, very impressive. I remember in 2007, I think it was, I took the new 777 from Bombay to New York. And I was so impressed by how incredible the aircraft was, how good the livery was, the fitting of the cabin, how excellent the service was. I remember writing about it and saying a new age for Air India has begun. The problem with all of that is that new planes are not enough. You have to know how to handle the planes. You have to know how to maintain the planes. You have to run an airline on the basis that your planes will constantly need renewal. They'll constantly need to be refurbished. Air India didn't do that. So will the new Air India necessarily do it? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But either way, planes alone are not enough. And there's no evidence really, let's be honest, that Air India knows how to handle new additions to its fleet. Though at Air India, they don't talk about this a lot. Air India has actually acquired many new aircraft over the last few months. They just don't acknowledge it. They've acquired the entire Vistara fleet. And if you look at the way in which they've integrated Vistara and its fleet into Air India, it's been a disaster. Apart from the fact that they fought with the pilots who threatened some kind of industrial action, they had to back down, had to come to some kind of settlement. Even the planes themselves have not been properly utilized. I'll give you an example. Air India is now part owned by Singapore Airlines, which is actually the reason they merged Vistara into Air India, but that's a different story. Singapore Airlines, like many other airlines, makes most of its profits from what are called high-yield passengers. High-yield passengers are people who sit in the front of the aircraft in business class, in first class, and the like. So most airlines, and there is a mixed record of airlines in treating economy class passengers. Air India is not the only one that treats them badly. But generally, premium passengers are always pampered by every airline. Air India, for instance, was the only airline domestically that had a big business class, and it competed with Jet Airways, which ran one of the best business classes, domestic business classes in the world. Vistara, which tried to compete with Jet in the business class segment, never really succeeded. Eventually, business class on Vistara aircraft became 2 rows because they couldn't get people to fly. Most people would fly Jet Airways. Now, Air India, bizarrely, instead of, now it has a monopoly, instead of enjoying that monopoly, selling more business class seats, has decided on the metro routes where the money is to use Vistara aircraft, with these 2 rows of business class. The argument for that is, yeah, okay, we have only 2 rows of business class, but we have a very big premium economy, which the old Air India planes didn't have. I have no problem with that. And Air India has therefore been selling premium economy seats on various services and various routes. But so bad is the fleet integration that many times the aircraft they send to service those routes is an old Air India aircraft, not a Vistara aircraft, so it doesn't have premium economy. So people who've been booked into premium economy, have paid for it, are told at the last moment, sorry pal, we're going to have to downgrade you to plain old economy because we don't have a premium economy. After which there's a whole hassle of getting refunds from Air India. If you've dealt with airlines before, you'll know how difficult and how long it takes to get refunds. Now, I'll tell you a personal incident because this one I know is true. A family member I've written, but actually it was my son, was going to Bangkok. I said to him, travel Air India, it's my airline, I take it to Bangkok. So he booked himself in premium economy to on Air India to Bangkok. Shortly before he was going to leave, they messaged him to say, sorry, we've downgraded you, you're in economy. So he called me and I said, this happens. All airlines are not perfect. So he went to Bangkok. On his way back, just before he was arriving, he got another message. 3 days, 4 days? Another message from Air India saying, sorry, we've downgraded you to economy again. Again, presumably they didn't have the right aircraft. Now, being downgraded once is fine. But if you do it twice so soon, you begin to worry about the competence of the management. Any airline that is interested in its reputation will do what the hotel industry calls service recovery. They'll try and apologize to the passenger. They'll try and make it up to them some way because you want passengers who are willing to pay such high prices to come back to you. Air India, of course, did nothing. They sent one form message and waited for him to come economy. I tweeted about it because I thought this was not a great idea. Air India then, responding to the tweet, called my son. Of course, they hadn't worked out it was my son. They thought it was me, but that's another story. And they said, listen, we're sorry, but there's nothing we can do. So my son said, could I possibly get upgraded to business class? How much would it cost? So the guy who was talking to him, supposed to make up to him, said, I have no idea. My system doesn't show that. So he said, yeah, but I still need to know. So he said, okay, I'll have to do it manually and call you. So then they called him back an hour, 2 hours later, and they said it was 55,000 for that sector to upgrade to business. Fair enough. He said, if that's how much it costs, that's more than my entire return fare on premium, I won't do it. He went to the airport and there was no sign in which the old premium economy passengers, most of whom were complaining, who'd been downgraded, were being made up to or treated any better, but he had an idea. So he went to the counter and he said, I'd like to get upgraded to business class. Is there room? And they said, yeah, sure. It's 4,000 baht, which is about 10,000 rupees. Not quite the 55,000 he was told. So he paid the money and he sat business class and he traveled. It was okay in the end, but he's been left with no goodwill for Air India. Not only did this happened twice in a row, but the people who were supposed to do service recovery makeup had no clue. They gave him one rate, it cost him another rate. If this is not bad management, what is bad management? I will give you many examples like this because when I tweeted, there was like a flurry of messages from people explaining how exactly this had happened. I had people who's not just on Vistara flights, but who's at booking long distance flights in so-called premium economy for their parents who got to the airport and were told that, sorry, your elderly parents will now have to travel in economy. We don't have any premium economy or there's no room for them. And they were outraged because they weren't sure that their elderly parents were up to doing this. Air India didn't make up. It didn't care. There was no sense of respect for passengers. There was no sense of apology. There was no sense of we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. No, you travel what you like. We could have been traveling on a low-cost airline. Scoot, for example, that was as much interest as was paid to premium passengers. Anybody who knows anything about the aviation business, the airline business, will tell you that this is a problem. And this is, I think, the main problem. It's a problem when an airline focuses only on buying new planes. We'll buy new planes, everything will be all right, and uses the planes as a sort of shiny object is used to distract babies and doesn't focus on what is going on at the moment. Singapore Airlines, as I mentioned earlier, effectively runs Air India now. Singapore Airlines would have wanted to buy Air India, was not allowed to, the government was not keen to. So the Tatas bought Air India. They then merged Vistara, which was a domestic airline in which Singapore had a share, into Air India, and Singapore now has a share. So it was an interesting backdoor way of getting Singapore Airlines into the game. And Singapore Airlines has sent the MD. Singapore Airlines is a problem. It's a one-city state. It can't really expand. Access to Air India will allow it to take the Indian market and expand. So it's not a bad strategy for Singapore Airlines. It's not necessarily the best strategy for India. But that is the truth, which is how Singapore Airlines is managing Air India, treating all of this really as a sort of stopgap operation until the new planes come and they can start linking them with flights to Singapore and doing through flights from Singapore to the West via India. Why the Tatas are going along with this? Why they're allowing passengers to be mistreated? I don't know. It's something that maybe one day we will understand why the Tatas allowed themselves to be put into this situation, allowed themselves to be told to spend $7 billion and were told that one day things will get better. Meanwhile, every day there are headlines abusing Air India and effectively the Tatas. No? I have nothing against Campbell Wilson. I don't know him. From everything I have heard, he's a very nice guy. He's doing his best. But the truth is, it isn't working. Not in most areas. It's working in some. The in-flight, I think, has improved incredibly since the Singapore Airlines chaps took over. Let's not just say the Tatas. And I think the ground handling now, which Singapore Airlines was not good at in the Vistara days, Air India is doing much better than ever before. It's actually, I think, better ground handling than Vistara ever managed. So the situation is not hopeless. There are things that can be done. The problem is not a public center mentality. The problem is not just planes. The problem is just bad management. You've got to manage an airline making good use of its resources so there isn't a screw up all the time. You've got to respect your passengers. You've got to listen to their complaints. Every single time I've had a problem with Air India, nothing has happened until I've tweeted. Last week, I had a problem with the frequent flyer program where they wouldn't refund tickets and give me back my miles. It wasn't even money, I just wanted miles. And nobody said anything. I kept calling customer care, no response. Finally, I tweeted. I got a response. And Air India eventually admitted Air India was at fault and my miles were credited. But you can't run an airline on that basis. You can't run it on the basis that unless people complain, they won't get any kind of service. That probably is why so many people complain, because there is no alternative. What I think Air India needs to do is to go back to the values of J.R.D. Tata, the values of Ratan Tata. The Tatas were built on respect for people. If you deal with any of the Tatas, you deal with the Tata company, the operating principle is that we are here to serve you, which is why profits from the Tatas go mostly to charity. This is an aberration. I hope the Tatas realize this. Yes, of course, it's a mass transportation business, but it doesn't have to be a crap airline.